the art of a great photograph. I mean, you never actually did any formal training, but you managed to work it out yourself, did you? I know you work with fashion photographers, etc. So I'd be interested in knowing what you think makes a great photograph.
Well, okay, so just stepping back, I did have a little bit of formal training, in as much as I served an apprenticeship with this wonderful guy called Tom Blau at Camera Press in London, which was a big press agency, as I think you probably know. And what he gave me in a very concentrated 3 months or so was this fantastic sort of blueprint, this grounding in the certain fundamental basics as he saw them, which was basically composition was absolutely key. Composition, exposure, and focus. Control of focus, not the simple thing of is it sharp or is it out of focus, but the control of focus and the understanding of depth of field. So these were the sort of fundamentals, and I grasped that pretty quickly. And I learnt about processing film and making prints. So I learnt the basics, and then sort of went off and refined it in practice, really, and was able to get away with an awful lot by having that brazen confidence of youth. I mean, I was 16 and, I thought I was the bee's knees. I thought I was, great. I thought I had a vision and everything. I mean, terrible naivety, but it gives you the confidence to just plow forward. So when I started photographing musicians, which I guess is sort of early 63, for me, my early pictures of, say, Chad and Jeremy, which are curiously relevant because poor old Chad died 10 days ago. So, but everything about that was this basic knowledge of composition and exposure and focus, coupled with this energy and excitement and enthusiasm of youth, working with young people, albeit they were a year or two older than me, but nevertheless, they were very much of the younger generation. And we all wanted to break down the walls, the boundaries, the rules, however you want to put it. And so for me, what makes a great picture is a combination of all those things. Composition is still key for me, absolutely key. And I find, for instance, when a student or a young photographer asks me to review their work, one of the things that I might do, and I hope this doesn't sound terribly arrogant, because thinking about it, maybe it is, but one of the things that I've done is I've taken pictures they've sent me and I've modified the composition, particularly vertical lines and horizontal lines. And I've just sent them back and I've just said, for me, this makes your picture that much better, that much stronger, that much more powerful, and they've always responded very positively to that. And I hope it's just guidance and mentoring, if you like. But I've always felt that if you can show somebody an improvement in their own work, how to make their work better rather than treating it academically, then it's more effective. So for me, I guess those things are key. And the other really important thing in music photography is to not lose sight of the fact that even today, I think, the majority of people don't like having their pictures taken. And therefore, you have to try and help them deal with that without highlighting it. So it's a sort of hand-holding thing without actually touching them. That's one of the reasons why very, very early on, I decided that I didn't want to be a sort of reportage, fly on the wall photographer, because I wanted people to commit themselves to having their pictures taken. That it felt very early on, it felt that that was the way that I was going to get the best results for me. I didn't feel very comfortable shooting live photography. I did it, but I didn't really feel very comfortable with it, partly because the lighting was so awful in those early 60s, but also because it felt unrewarding to me photographically. And I, from the beginning, I always wanted to create images for people. And I felt that I could only do that if I was working with them, if it was a collaboration, and that you can only help people who basically don't like having their picture taken if you turn it into what I hope is a really enjoyable part of the process, part of the work of being a musician, a rock star, a pop star. It's part of the job. And that's the part of the job that I want to deal with and try and make successful.
So how much would you sort of imagine what the photograph's going to look like in your head? I mean, how much of it was like almost like painting a portrait, or was it working with what was in front of you and just molding it into a shape or a form that actually looked like a great composition?
That's a good question, because I think when you're working with a group of people in particular, you can only have any compositional ideas you have are very broad stroke, and they'll come to life when you get the group in front of you. With individual artists, it's a little bit more. It's a little different, because it's much more intimate. So for instance, when I did my first session with Kate Bush, I had a very strong idea of how I wanted her to be. But in the end, it would never have worked without her embracing what I had suggested and making it so fantastic. It couldn't have been done without her. It couldn't have been done in spite of her. And I think that generally is true 99% of the time. That although spontaneity plays a big part, if the subject isn't really working with you, doesn't embrace whatever concept between you've come up with, then it's not going to work. Or if it works, it's not going to be great. I mean, the line between an indifferent portrait and a great portrait is really narrow. One little step either way makes the difference. And that's quite a difficult thing also to get across, that you can look at two portraits from the same session and one just has that magic and the one either side of it just doesn't, and why?
Is it because it's like a moment of almost intimacy between the photographer and the subject? There's a connection there instead of it just being a photograph of a pile of bricks or something.
Well, it is an intimate process. Photographing people is an intimate process, and definitely getting the subject to give you that access is really important. And so I think a lot of energy, conscious and sort of subconscious, goes into trying to make your subject comfy with you and trust with you. I mean, trust is a very important thing, but you have to build that sometimes in a very short space of time. But you have to make sure, you have to make your subject realize that you are on their side. And, I used to feed people at the studio, partly because musicians were nearly always hungry. Often they're just rolled out of the sack and maybe were a bit hungover or still a bit stoned from the night before and were hungry and hadn't had anything, they didn't have time to get anything. So I would feed people, but it gave me an opportunity to weigh them up, to suss out any little relationship things within a band that might be exploitable or keep clear of, or whatever it was. And so that gave me a chance. And eating is a good thing, where sharing food is a good opportunity. In itself, it's quite an intimate thing. So that was a key part of a lot of what I did, making people feel that I was on their side, I was working for them, I was trying to bring out the best. That was always key.
Initially, you worked in the fashion world as a photographer, and it's not really your world, is it? I mean, and then you crossed over into music. But did you bring anything from the fashion world? The way, the way the photographs are taken or used into the music world. And we talk about breaking down the barriers and the boundaries before in 63, 64, that period, and that's what makes that period really interesting. And was that kind of a key part of the process, bringing different disciplines together?
Well, that's also interesting because I'd never really thought about it. I mean, my experience as an assistant to a fashion photographer was very, very brief. And the photographer was a man called Alec Murray. He was a lovely, wonderful man. And he wasn't a great, inspiring fashion photographer. He was a workhorse fashion photographer. He was somebody who he was the sort of meat and potatoes of fashion photography. He wasn't the wild Vogue magazine type photographer. And maybe if I'd worked for Bailey or Donovan or Duffy, I would have got much more out of it, but I didn't. In fact, Alec Murray warned me against those photographers. Sort of, you don't want to be like those, they're naughty boys type thing. But what I learned fundamentally was that I didn't like the world, the fashion world. I didn't like the people. I didn't feel anything for the clothes. I've never really liked clothes particularly. I've always wanted to like clothes, but I've never been able to. I was never able to wear clothes very well. Fashion never meant anything to me. And so it wasn't, but I've looked at fashion. I've admired fashion photographers. I used to, particularly in the 60s and the 70s, I used to look at Harper's and Queen and Vogue a lot. And a lot of what I did, I applied, I learned a lot about technique and lighting, but I applied it in the same way that I would from looking at Karsh of Ottawa's portrait of Churchill or Arnold, I was going to say Alfred Newman, but it's Arnold Newman's picture of the Mad magazine influence was also there.
Well, it probably was actually.
Yes, almost certainly. But so composition. But whether it was fashion, there was a wonderful American photographer. Gosh, his name has escaped me, actually. But he did a lot. There was a fashion brand in the days when fur was acceptable, called Black Glamour. And they used celebrities, Elizabeth Taylor, Sophia Loren, I don't know who, Audrey Hepburn, in their clothes. And this, I think his name was Skrebneski, but it's neither here nor there. He was a marvelous photographer. And I loved those pictures. I tried to emulate those. Some of that even crept in to my pictures of Hendrix. Which, believe it or not, was influenced by sort of Avedon and Bailey and those sort of black. So inevitably, I was influenced by photographers from all sorts, but fashion per se didn't really do very much for me.
Yeah, I was just kind of asking because the Stones and the Hendrix pictures, they are I mean, of course, they're iconic shots because they're beautifully taken shots, but the groups actually look really good as well. And there's was reading an interview somewhere. I mean, Hendrix turned up at the session looking like that. He was 24/7 Jimi Hendrix. There was no, that wasn't just dressing for the photo. He was already there, wasn't he? That was him, wasn't it?
Absolutely. 24/7 Jimi Hendrix is great, actually. It's a really good line, because he was. Yes, with Jimi, the thing about Jimi was, and I think you see this in a lot of photographers, a lot of photography of him, is that you don't, when you look at him, you see this fantastic creature almost, this wild person. At least that's what I did. I saw this extraordinary wild man with this fantastic hair, quite unkempt and completely unusual, unexpected for a black man in those days. We're talking about, I mean, Screaming Jay Hawkins, for instance, was a very wild looking chap, but he, his hair was processed straight and pulled back, and his look was wild, but it was theatrical. It was it was almost like a fancy dress. Jimi had a naturalness to him that was felt completely unique and felt really special. But when he was also very passive, and he was very gentle, and he was very humble, and he was laid back. He wasn't like his onstage presence. And so you had to draw something out of him. And that was the challenge with Jimi. You could take any number of pictures of him and he'd look wonderful, but getting that contact, getting that extraordinary eye line with him, where he suddenly let you in, where he gave you access, that was really key to it. And I look at lots of pictures of Jimi, and I don't see that in a lot of other pictures. They might be fabulous pictures, but they don't have that. And I think that what I did, without really understanding what I was doing, but what I managed to do was somehow get him to give me and the camera that access that makes those pictures extra special. And by the way, I don't think he looked as good ever again. I don't think that the tie-dyed Woodstock Jimi, although he was amazing looking, I don't think he was as good as he looked in those very early days. For me, and I've always just accepted the way he evolved, but looking objectively at them, I don't think he ever looked as good ever again.
No, it was that moment of time that I think it's the Regency dandy period, isn't it? That it's kind of looking back to Victoriana, also slightly hippie-ish, and that little flux of ideas is absolute perfection. So at the same time, the Stones, and especially with Brian Jones, were right at the epicenter of that as well. And who's taking their picture? It's you again.
Well, yes. I mean, as it turns out, as history turns out, that was an extraordinary time to work with the Stones, because, they hadn't had Satisfaction yet. So they hadn't actually made it, although they'd been around for 2 or 3 years, they hadn't actually made it on the grand scale. They toured America. I think they toured America twice in 64. And when I photographed them in 65, I think they'd already done or were just about to do their 3rd tour. And then I went on the road with them for their 4th tour of America. But they hadn't really broken big. It took bands a lot longer in those days to make it. There's no two ways about it. They had to pay their dues and work on the circuit, but it was a magical moment again, because they were on the cusp of making it huge. Mick and Keith were starting to write, which was a huge turning point. Brian was still looking probably the most charismatic of all of them. He was probably still not, I don't like calling him the leader of the band, but he probably was still on the edge of his period of being the leader of the band.
Which is underlined by the Out of Our Heads album cover, which you took, that's outside your studio, isn't it? You took that picture. It's a fantastic picture. It's got everything you need in a photo, you know, the composition, the lines. I mean, how did you arrange them to go into that shape, or do they just kind of naturally flop into that shape?
What happened was we were taking pictures. I don't know whether you've seen the whole shoot, but there's some pictures. There was a building site. So this is just outside my studio in what's called Ormond Yard. And it was one of my favorite locations, even in those early days. I'd always take bands out of my studio. And I had two options, which was go into Mason's Yard or go into Ormond Yard. And I used to use both. And I photographed the Stones, both in Mason's and Ormond. But in Ormond Yard at that time, there was a big building site. And there were a pile of bricks, and it was open. It had a sort of bomb site feel to it. They were still working on the, you know, the, what do you call it? The grounding, the foundation, sorry. They were still working on the foundation. So it was deep. And it was open. And at the edge of the building site, there were these piles of bricks, which I used the band to sit on and to stand on and to pose around. And just stacked next to the pile of bricks, there were these hoardings, these big hoardings that must have been 10 or 12 feet tall and about the same length. And they were used at night to board the building site off to stop people falling in from Ormond Yard into the building. And they were just stacked, literally, they were stacked like that. And I was photographing them, and I looked to my right, and I saw this narrow shape. And I thought that it lent itself, if I could squeeze them in there somehow, it lent itself to an album cover, because it gave me areas either side of the band. So I had this sort of composition where the record company could put their logo, which in those days always went in the top right. And they liked to put the name of the band and the title of the album also towards the top, because in racking, in the days of racking. So I knew that if I took photographs that lent themselves to those specifications, then there was a good chance that I might get a cover. So I tried to shoot as much as I could as a potential cover. So if you look at the pictures of the guys on the bricks, there's a lot of space above them, because I thought, well, you know, you can put a title there. You can put Rolling Stones, The Rolling Stones, whatever it is. So I was always thinking about that. I was thinking about magazine covers, or NME covers, or whatever it was. So I always felt that that was part of my job, and that composition just worked. And of course, the band were great about it. I mean, if you can squeeze a group of 4 or 5 people into a physical space, it forces them into a close proximity, which is quite difficult to achieve when they're in a room or on a background, because people don't feel comfortable being that close to other people, even in a band. And a camera exaggerates the space between people. So in order to get 5 heads in a composition, they have to be almost touching each other. So that in itself is intimate, and it's quite difficult to engineer. So if you can find a space, a corner, and I learned from looking at Irving Penn's work from the 1940s, particularly his portraits, where he created a corner in the studio and he pushed people into a corner. The composition is very similar. you have a corner and you stick somebody in a corner so that they're actually held in, and it makes them work. So that was it. And the band worked beautifully. I put Brian in the front because I knew his blonde hair would read against the bodies of the others, and he had white trousers, so that helped him stand out. And the others just, fell into place. And I think the only problem, and it's an ongoing problem whenever you work with a band, is that somebody has to be at the back, and you have to try and communicate to them that they need to make that space, even if it's at the back, work by concentrating on the camera. And if you look at Bill, who's the furthest away, he's just looking straight at the camera. And it doesn't matter that he's a little bit smaller, because he's addressing the camera. He makes his presence felt. And that was always one of the problems when you photograph a band, particularly in the studio. Somebody has to be at the back, and they don't like it. And it's nearly always the bass player or the drummer. Or it just tends to be.
I like it because the band, like Brian's hair, is very round. Everything's very spherical. But the surroundings are very linear, stark lines, and I don't know if you actually planned that. I'd imagine you probably did, but I like that contrast in it.
I'd like to say that I did. I just thought it would make funny enough, somebody on Twitter yesterday or the day before asked me exactly that. What made you think? What made you shoot that? And I just said, because I thought it would make a good album cover. And it did. There was I don't think there was ever time to think Brian looked like that. That was how he looked. It wasn't contrived. I mean, Brian loved his hair. He fussed about his hair. Brian was the only one who ever carried a little bit of makeup. He always had a little bit of what we called slap, a little bit of foundation. So, if anybody had a pimple or a bit of acne that was a bit, he'd be the one who'd take a slap and put a little bit on Mick's face or whatever. He was the one he was the most conscious of his image at that point in time. Charlie was as well, but it wasn't a vanity thing in the same way with Charlie. It was just, he loved clothes. Even then, he loved clothes, and he loved that sort of East Coast jazz hipness, but Brian was the most charismatic. He was the most, I wouldn't want to say rock and roll, but he was the most pop. He had a real image going for him that was different. And he had an attitude like a little bantam cock, strutting and not exactly confrontational, but, he had that body as well. He had the perfect, they all did actually, Mick, Keith and Brian, but Brian particularly had that thing of a slightly big head, tiny, narrow little hips, no bum really. I mean, and quite broad in proportion. So they had that sort of fantastic shape. It was almost as though they were made by a wide angle lens somehow. They just lent themselves.
Yeah, they always say that was the classic British rock star look, wasn't it, for a long time, wasn't it?
Absolutely.
So how closely did you work with Loog Oldham? Andrew, he brought you in to do the Stones because you'd done Marianne Faithfull before, because you knew her before you'd even met the Stones, hadn't you? So you did some sessions with Marianne, and that got Andrew Loog Oldham interested. So what was it like working with Andrew? Was he very was he a lot of ideas? Was he planning things out, or was he just knew this was going to be a kinetic situation, just left it?
Yes. What Andrew was firstly, Andrew was more Rolling Stones than the Stones. That energy of the Stones was absolutely in Andrew. Andrew was more confrontational. He was more aggressive. He was more pushy than the Stones were. the Stones were lovely. I mean, even Brian at this point in time, they were lovely. They worked with me. They were kind and generous to me. You know, I was a kid. I mean, 65. I was 18 for that first session. So I really was a kid with a Hasselblad. They didn't make it difficult. They made it easy. They embraced me. They took me under their wing almost. It was almost as though they willed me to take good pictures of them. And but it was Andrew who was, you know, swearing and shouting and, you know, getting everybody worked up. One had to deal with Andrew, and he was almost more difficult than the band. But he was an absolute genius at bringing the best out of people. And I felt that throughout the 60s, not just with the Stones, but throughout the 60s, he always brought the best out of me. And I did an awful lot of work with him at Immediate Records. And I always felt that he stretched, he pushed, he supported. And when you took a really great picture, my God, he embraced it and he used it. You know, I mean, you know, his idea of not really putting much lettering, I mean, between the buttons, you know, you couldn't see where the name of the band were. He just relied on the photograph and the vibe and the feeling. You know, and that was true of the adverts. We just had pictures. I mean, I remember doing a full page advert for him for Ichiku Park. And the band Small Faces were in Europe performing, so we couldn't get a session with them in time. And I had the idea of getting 4 little kids, 6-7-year-old kids, and I had a sign that said Ichiku Park in a sort of stylized street sign. And I just gave it to the kids and I took them to Hampstead Heath. And I just got them being kids with this sign, pulling on it and running with it. And so I had 4 little small faces with Ichiku. And Andrew loved that. And he just used it with nothing else. Nothing else at all. No other text, no other copy. Just these little small faces with. And so his support and his enthusiasm and his imagination was, you know, absolutely brilliant. So I love Andrew. I still love Andrew. He's I think he's an extraordinary chap, and he was very inspiring. But most of all, he gave you this belief in yourself and this support. He was brilliant at bringing people together. In fact, I recently learnt. I never knew this, but he recently told me that really the only reason he put me on the 65 tour was to make the band feel important, because the Beatles had Deso Hoffman on the road with them. And it was not a question of competing what the Beatles did. It was a question of trying to make the band feel bigger and better and more important. So, that was, I don't think he was remotely interested in the photography. You know, I was a prop. I never understood that. I mean, I really didn't. And I don't resent it in the slightest bit, because, you know, it was a marvelous experience. And anything that Andrew thought was a good idea, for whatever reason, works for me. So.
And the byproduct of that, he's got some really great live shots. I know you don't like doing live photography, but those are fantastic shots. A lot of great. And you're saying the lighting wasn't that good at the gigs, but in a way, that's what makes those photographs great. You know, there's just one light, and the way you capture it on Jagger or going across the stage, or because you take a lot of live shots actually on the stage as well, which I've always loved. I don't like particularly the live photography from the pit forwards. I like it when you can see the crowd over somebody's shoulder. So, then there was no form to what a live shot should be. So you really playing around with it?
Well, I did. And it was really interesting. I mean, that's lovely to hear you say that. I feel extremely pleased that you feel that way, and I appreciate your enthusiasm for the work. I think part of my problem was that the lighting was very, very poor, and even on some of the gigs, I couldn't actually get an exposure, and so I was pushed all the time just to get an exposure. I mean, and a lot of live photographers from the 60s will tell you the same thing, that you know, Godless, for instance, when he was doing CBGBs, he just didn't know whether he was going to get enough light to create a negative that he could print from. And I just pushed everything as far as I could. So, and I was shooting both 35mm, but where I could, I shot on the Hasselblad, which was completely bonkers because nobody took a Hasselblad on tour as far as I knew. Well, nobody had done it before me anyway. But also because I wore spectacles, and because of the heat and the sweat and everything, my specs would steam up. And so using a 35mm, I couldn't really see. And I didn't know about diopters. You know, I didn't know about getting correction lenses on the camera viewpiece, the viewfinder. I didn't know about that. I don't even know whether it was optional in those days. So my Nikon, I would steam up. I couldn't see a fucking thing through my Nikon. But with the Hasselblad, it didn't matter because I was looking down. I didn't have an eye level viewfinder. I had a waist level viewfinder. So I was looking down. So I was shooting it sort of wide open at a 15th of a second, which I reckoned was just about fast enough. And then I was pushing the film as much as I possibly could. So that was probably to about 1600 ASA or maybe 3200 if possible. And because I didn't have any choice at all, but because I did have the access, a lot of my pictures were from the back, looking over Mick's shoulder with the spotlight into my face or into his face. And the audience, or a sense of the audience and the sense of the theater, a sense of the surrounding, and just hope that I was going to capture something. And I did. The reason why for years I didn't feel good about it was that they had no outlet. Nobody saw those pictures at the time. I now understand one of the reasons being that Andrew wasn't really that interested in them, but also the media wasn't really interested in a picture of the Stones playing a gig in Washington, DC a week or 2 weeks previously. That didn't really mean anything. And also some of the pictures were so contrasty that they couldn't reproduce with the reproduction methods that were available in the press in those days. So I'm always been somebody who, if the pictures didn't get seen, if they didn't get published, then I felt they were a disappointment. I felt they were a failure. I mean, I felt that, I didn't think I had done a very good job. And it wasn't until many years later when I reviewed them that I realized that I did capture something quite special about the time. And, thank you so much for acknowledging and recognizing that. And I'm very proud of a lot of what I did then, but it took the best part of 30 years to get to that. And I felt I'd failed. I felt it was a disappointment.
Same with the Jimi Hendrix shots, the iconic nature of the Jimi Hendrix shots and how at the time they weren't iconic, but it was like 20 years later, they kind of got rediscovered. And it was that plus the idea of knowing they're good, whether they get used or not, I guess.
Yes, it was a strange thing about the Hendrix session because, as I mentioned earlier yesterday, in a way, I would gauge the success or failure of my work by how it was responded to. And initially, Chas Chandler was thrilled with my pictures of Jimmy. He felt that I'd captured what he had seen, and he thought that and he supported me in my, what looking back was clearly a mistake, but he supported me in the concept of only photographing in black and white, and that I wanted to take him very seriously as a musician, treat him with dignity, and I felt black and white was the appropriate thing. And Chas supported me in that. He never queried that, never questioned that. And unfortunately, the record company insisted on having color. And I don't know what the reason, we never discussed it, but he went to somebody else for the first record cover. He went to Robert, I can't even think the guy's name at the moment. But nevertheless, he went somewhere else. And I always felt that although the pictures were used a little bit, that they never reached their full potential. And I always felt that they were a bit of a failure. And it wasn't until I started revisiting them for my own purposes initially in the early 80s, but primarily in the 90s, that I started revisiting the work and thinking that actually, it was really, really good. And as I showed it at my exhibitions and in the books, people responded to it incredibly positively. And it sort of took off, and it became the guy who managed the Hendrix estate at that time, sort of rediscovered me and them, and he just loved them. He just felt that what I'd caught or what Jimmy had given me was just so true to life, something that he'd seen in Jimmy, and he just felt that sort of magic was there and was something special. And then since then, the pictures have become truly iconic.
So how close were they to being the actual album cover?
I don't think we'll ever know. I have a memory of track records using the classic picture with his hands on his hips in the military jacket as the cover for a sampler that they sent to radio stations. Not that there were many radio stations then, but they sent them to DJs, radio stations, magazines, newspapers as a sample of what was to come. But I never got it. I never saw it. I've tried to track down a copy. I've spoken to various Hendrix obsessives, and they've never seen it. So maybe it was my imagination, or maybe it was an idea that we worked on that never happened. I never had a relationship with track. I didn't really know Kit Lambert and Chris Stamp very well. I liked Chris Stamp a lot, but I didn't get on with Kit at all. And so I never had a relationship with track as such. My relationship was with Chas and with Jimmy. And I don't know. I don't know. I don't think Chas was the sort of person who would have fought for a particular picture. I don't think he would have felt, he wasn't that visual in many ways, I mean, he was, in my estimation, he was a great manager, and he did fantastic things with Jimmy and then with Slade, who were one of my favorite bands.
They're a brilliant band, underrated.
Yeah, absolutely underrated and a wonderful band. But I don't think he would have ever, I remember when I shot a cover for Slade for Nobody's Fools, for the album Nobody's Fools. And I think I'd done every cover for Slade up until that point. And I shot Nobody's Fools, and I asked him, I said to him, I'd love you to do this as a black and white image with the clown nose is red. And he virtually said, and I'm not quoting him, but the gist of what it was that I'm paying for color and I want color on the cover. And I think that and it just didn't work as well. It didn't have the same impact. It wasn't reproduced very well. Polydor were famous for printing on the cheapest possible materials. It was toilet roll cardboard. It was the same cardboard they used on toilet rolls. So it was brown cardboard to start with. It was awful stuff. And I was always very disappointed in that, but he always struck me. He was never interested in coming to the sessions unless it was because he had something to say to the band. He never wasn't interested at all. He'd look at the work, he'd go, oh, that's fantastic, great, we can use all of these, or whatever it was. So going back to Jimmy, I don't know whether he would have ever stood up for a particular picture. I think it was much more important to him to get the music that he wanted. And I don't think he was bothered about the covers very much. I think if he had been, I don't think they would have ever done Electric Ladyland, for instance.
Yeah, it was strange for somebody who's so brilliantly visual and charismatic, how poor the artwork was on most of the album covers.
Yes, that reflects the time. The artist had nothing to do, very, very little, if anything, to do with the covers. I don't even think Jimmy was consulted on Electric Ladyland. I don't think he was consulted on any of them. And I don't think anybody understood at that point really about a conceptual cover, participating, being involved in the creation of the cover. I don't think artists were that conscious that they could be. I don't think they'd understood that they were paying for the cover. Nobody had ever explained to them, that part of the expenses that come out is the cost of the cover. And they only ever understood that when they started making demands in the late 60s for gatefolds and pull-out sleeves and sleeves that turned into 3D cutouts. And the record company would always just say, yes, you can have that. It's going to cost you 1 3/4 an album. And then they go, oh, wait a minute, hold on.
Yes,
maybe not.
What did Hendrix himself think of those photographs? Did he ever say anything, or was he just come in, do the pictures, go? He went off to Hastings Pier after that session.
Yes, well, that's my memory. It might have been somewhere else on the South Coast, but I always remember Hastings Pier for some reason. I didn't see him again for about 6 or 7 weeks when I got asked to do the second session. And I was terribly taken aback that they should want me to do a second session so quickly. So I rushed round to Chaz's office, and the boys were there. And I realized the moment I stepped in what was going on, because Mitch and Noel had permed their hair to look more like Jimmy. So they looked more like a unit. Jimmy was beginning to, what are those steel-pronged combs you call? So he'd begun to pull his hair out. So he'd lost that initial sort of wild, natural, untamed look. And he had much more of an afro. And then Mitch and Noel had these ridiculous perms. And so Chaz said to me, look, I don't need any more pictures of Jimmy because I just love the pictures that you've done, but I do need more pictures of the band because, they've changed the hair. So I just did a session. The second session was just Jimmy and the band. And Jimmy said when he said, I love the pictures, man, sort of thing. And that was it. We didn't discuss it. He didn't enlarge on it. I just sensed that he was very happy to do a second session with me. And we all got on. I think the second session, although there are some really lovely pictures in it, I tried something a bit experimental, which only worked. It only came off in about 30-40% of the pictures. But even so, it was an interesting session. And as I say, I got some really lovely pictures of the three of them. But that was it then. I saw him a few times, places like the Ad Lib and the Cromwellian and things like that. But I always said hello, and he was always extremely friendly, that wonderful smile, a hug, and all right. And that was it, really, And then people off into the stratosphere. Yeah, he was. I mean, that's my overriding memories of this very sweet, charming, quiet, humble, modest chap. Just passive, gentle, really, and funny. And one of the things that struck me looking back and thinking about it and looking at the pictures and hearing people's feedback to the pictures, at exhibitions and things like that, was that in a way, this must have been an incredibly positive and optimistic moment in his life. Possibly the most exciting moment in his career, because number one, he'd escaped America. And I mean that as an escape, because America must have been the most oppressive place and God knows must still be for a lot of people, but must have been a most oppressive place for a musician of his type at that moment in time. And he wasn't getting anywhere. You know, he was passing the hat around at Café War. You know, and here suddenly he's whisked off to London. He's playing music that he really loves. He's making great music. The industry and the press and Britain has embraced him. I don't think there was any negativity towards him whatsoever. And in, you know, in many ways, particularly in music, you know, we were a much more integrated, a much more multiracial society, or at least we were on the surface. And so here he was. Hey Joe was about to be released, or it had just been released. He had this incredible future. I think he loved Mitch and Noel. I think he must have been at this extraordinary moment, this threshold, and knowing it, you know, knowing that he had everything. It must have been absolutely wonderful for him.
Was he aware of his image at all? I mean, his image, to me, his image is so perfect because he matches the music absolutely. Just you see him, you know what he sounds like. Was he aware of this at all? Or was he just, some people are completely unaware, aren't they, you know, of the power they have?
I think he was just, I mean, I think that, as I said to you yesterday, I don't think he ever looked better than he did at this early stage. Because of that, because it was a completely natural look. As far as I know, certainly there were no stylists. I know that Brian Jones had taken Jimmy shopping, had introduced him to Granny Takes a Trip, and he or somebody else, I think maybe a girlfriend, had taken him to Kensington Market, you know, the antique market that used to be opposite Bieber, that used to sell lots and lots of old clothes, secondhand clothes. And he bought a lot from there, and the military jacket from Lord Kitchener's valet. But I think everything that he saw and that moment in time, it just suited him. It was as though he was made for that moment. I think you said that yesterday, or words to that effect. He was in the right place at the right time. And I don't think he was aware of just anything more than expressing how he felt about he should look. I don't think it was contrived enough for him to say, does this work? He knew it worked. It wasn't a question of, does this work? It was, you know, he knew. And if you see, you know, that session is, my first session with him is dominated by the classic picture and the smoking picture, and those two jackets. But there's quite a lot of other material in other clothes that is incredibly beautiful. In fact, my favorite pictures are in an extraordinary sort of granny type black velvet jacket with balloon sleeves and beautiful jacket. I love the pictures that I did of him in that because he looks so delicate and almost fragile. And so I don't think he began to become aware of it until some people started changing. And that's what I meant yesterday about, I don't think he ever looked as good. And for me, when I look at the Woodstock Jimmy, it looks more like somebody trying to be Jimi Hendrix. Do you know what I mean? And girlfriends were involved, and people were making clothes for him, and that's all fine. And I know that real Hendrix fan, you've got to move with the time, you've got to move with the man. But I still think, looking back at those whole 3 years, he never looked as good or as natural or as positive or as optimistic as he did in that first session with me. I really don't.
I guess this is one of the skills of being a rock and roll photographer. The moment of time that person perfectly encapsulates what they are and what they look like, you have to be there, don't you? And we could sort of stretch it out to with the Stones. And now it'd be good to talk about Between the Buttons sleeve, because in a sense, that's the Stones in a similar period, isn't it? That's when they look the best, you know, the way they dress, they sounding great, and also the way they actually hang on to each other and they look like a band instead of all being different individuals. I mean, was there a
Yeah,
sense of that as well? And also I'd be interested to talk about this because this is one of the first times that a photographer has actually created the album cover, haven't they? Before that, you were just taking shots of bands which could be used for promo. It could be used. It could be used for anything. You wouldn't know, but this is actually specifically made for a cover of an album as well.
it was. I don't think that it was a total given that what we were going to do was going to be the cover, but the object of the exercise was to try and get a cover. And I had this homemade filter that I'd created a little bit earlier, and I'd shot some of the recording session pictures using the filter. And I'd created the filter because one of the problems about photographing in the recording studio was, apart from the fact that you never get the whole band together, you're always talking about individuals, is that they're very difficult to get the background away. I couldn't get the background completely out of focus. I didn't have any post-production tools to do that, as you do now. And so I decided to create this sort of vignette around them, a sort of circular vignette using black card and a bit of Vaseline to blur the edges, to try and make the background less intrusive and focus more on the individual. And I really liked the results. Andrew seemed to like them. And so I wanted to apply that to a group picture. And then, as I've said numerous times, as we came out of the recording session one morning, early morning, whatever it is, 5:30, 6 o'clock, and we're standing on the pavement outside Olympic, and I just looked at the band, and, you know, they were, by that time, as you pointed out, they had come together as a band in 66 particularly, and they were looking fabulous because in 66 they started getting some real money. So they bought houses, they bought cars, and they bought clothes, of course. And so their style was evolving. They all had a sort of charisma, both as a band and as individuals. So they were looking great. I looked at them on the pavement. They were hungover and they were stoned and they were tired. And I just said to Andrew, God, the guys, they just look like the Rolling Stones. You know, they really do look like the Rolling Stones. And I said, why don't we do a session? You know, why don't we do a session after all night? And everybody agreed. And I decided to do it on Primrose Hill, or I proposed that we did it on Primrose Hill because, you know, Primrose Hill's high, and I thought we'd get the early morning sun. I didn't think about it any more than that, really. And it sort of was a nice place to be. And so we whisked off, and I knew that we wouldn't have very long. We walked up the hill. We shared a couple of joints going up the hill, so everybody was quite stoned, not merry, because we were all too tired and it was cold and everything. And I had my Hasselblad with this cumbersome sort of thing on the front, and we started shooting the moment we got up there, and we shot a lot of different setups, but all in about 30 minutes, 35, 40 minutes, maybe tops. And they just came together, and the filter, I couldn't show them what the filter was doing, but I explained to them that they had to keep quite tight. And they knew that anyway, because we'd done other sessions. And the filter just sort of pushed them together by blurring what was around them. And it just came together really magically. And there was one difficult moment when I thought Brian was really fucking the session up. He was hiding and he was putting his collar up and he was turning his back and reading a newspaper. And I turned around and I said to Andrew, with my back to the band, I said, Andrew, I'm really worried Brian's fucking the session up. And Andrew was absolutely brilliant. He just said to me, look, don't give it a second thought, because whatever Brian does, it doesn't matter. It'll only contribute to the Rolling Stones. So don't worry about it. Don't give it a second thought. Just let him do whatever he wants to do. And of course, that's Andrew's genius. He knew that people would say, well, why is Brian covering up? Why is Brian turning his back? Why is Brian not looking in the camera? But it would be a talking point. If Brian didn't want to look in the camera, well, fuck him. Let him do whatever the fuck he wants. It'll just make the Stones.
Yeah, your eye is actually drawn straight to him because he's not playing the camera. It's like anti-photograph.
Yes. It's punk. Very punk.
Yeah. And he makes a great picture. And also the Vaseline as well. It adds to the hungover, kind of slightly swirly, kind of slightly psychedelic vibe of the picture as well. So is that a fortuitous, like a extra?
No, I think I was very conscious of the increasing influence of drugs, both in our society and the culture that we were part of, and in the music and in the way the music was evolving. I was aware of the band increasingly getting into different drugs. Not that there was a lot at the studio, it was still really just dope. There wasn't anything else going, but there was talk about it, and there was odd people would appear at the studio and packages would be passed. It was still very private. It was still quite hidden, but anything other than hash or grass. But I was aware of it, and I was aware of acid. I hadn't taken acid, but I was aware of acid because back in '65, Brian had in fact asked me if I wanted to share his he had an LSD, I don't know whether it was a sugar cube or a tab or whatever it was, but he said, oh, I've got one more dose left. Do you want to share it with me? And I said, Brian, I said, no, thank you. I said, you know that I don't do acid, so no thanks. And he went, oh yeah, of course, man. Of course, I forgot. I tell you what, I'll take the whole dose and you come and write down everything I say. I said, no, thanks, Brian. You take the whole dose and have fun. I'm not playing this game. So I was aware of acid, and other friends of mine were taking acid. So I was aware of it, and I had a sense of it. So yes, it was very intentional to try and impart it was supposed to be a subtle sense of blurring, of dissolving, of being part of your environment, of that freedom that hippies were talking about. It was definitely supposed to be that. That was part of the idea.
As somebody who worked in a visual medium, were you not interested in exploring like LSD, etc.?
I think I was too much of a coward. I never wanted to be out of control. I think part of being a photographer is an awful lot of photographers are very controlling people. I don't think I'm a particularly controlling but I think it is an element of being a photographer. I mean, you have to control the light, the exposure. Controlling what you see and what you make is a big part of what you do. And every time I tried to do a session, if I was a bit stoned or a bit drunk, it was a disaster. I felt the whole thing slipping through my hands, and I didn't like what I was doing, and I felt it distressed me, and I never really wanted to be. And I guess I was frightened of it. I loved Smokie. I loved dope. I loved grass. I loved hash. I loved giggling and all the laughter that went with it. I loved getting the munchies. I loved all of that. I loved listening to music while stoned, but I never wanted to be so out of it. And also, I think the thing is that I did see quite a few people who were completely out of it. And it was awful. For me, it was a horrible sight. Seeing Brian, collapsing into his food, head first into his duck à l'orange. Boom. It was horrible. We didn't really understand what was going on. And I didn't care for the responses around him. People were unsympathetic because they didn't really understand what was going on, and it was sad, and felt sad, and it felt tragic. It didn't look like fun to me. Didn't look like something. And I wasn't sure about the mind expanding my mind. I mean, I felt quite happy with my mind as it was. So I was too quite cowardly, too frightened to let go that much.
Well, there was a lot of mythology around it, wasn't there? I mean, a lot of people had the imagination already, didn't they? And they didn't always need enhancing.
Yeah, I mean, I was around a lot of very stoned people, and I got on very well. I mean, I didn't seem to get in their way, and they didn't seem to get in my way. I just didn't, I drew the line. I left the room. I wasn't interested. I mean, the first time I saw anybody do cocaine, which I suppose was about that time, 66, 67, I thought it was really offensive. I thought it was like, mainlining. It seemed offensive to me. I thought it was aesthetically so ugly. You see, the other thing that people have forgotten is that smoking, virtually everybody smoked ordinary cigarettes. That's what I mean. Everybody smoked. Everybody smoked everywhere, in restaurants, in cinemas, on buses, in the tube, on trains. Everybody smoked all the time. So smoking, it was cool, actors would be photographed with a cigarette. My dad, his publicity pictures have him with a cigarette. Smoke, jazz pictures were full of smoke and cigarette. Smoking was normal. So smoking a joint felt completely normal. You just had this lovely, giggly, funny effect. And it didn't feel in any sense dangerous at all. But the aesthetics of other drug taking, I found offensive, and I didn't like them at all.
Speaking of Andrew, I mean, he and your father, I was reading the other day that Andrew was actually inspired by your father, wasn't he? The Expresso Bongo, which your father wrote, which became the Cliff Richard film. Andrew kind of based part of his hustler whiz kid persona on it, didn't he?
He did, and it's so funny because Expresso Bongo was very important to me and to us as a family. It was a big breakthrough for my dad. It was a hugely successful musical at the Saville Theatre, believe it or not, in whatever it was, 56, 57, I can't remember exactly. The film was great. I went to the set of the film. I met Cliff and the Shads, and, it was great. And I always loved it. But I never understood until relatively recently, until Andrew started writing about the importance of Expresso Bongo and seeing it. When he was 14, his mum took him to the theatre, and it did change his life. But he never told me that. He wouldn't give me that sort of pleasure. He never told me that at the time. He teased me about who my father was, he'd take the piss out of me for being son of Wolf, as a lot of people did, because a lot of people assumed that I was only where I was because of him. That's what happens. That's something that happens. I remember Paul McCartney said to me one evening, we were having dinner, and he said to me, "It must be really tough having a famous father," which I thought was so sweet of him. It was such an insightful thing to say. And I said, "Oh, it can be, especially a father like mine." Anyway, that's by the by. But yeah, so Andrew was very influenced by Bongo, and but Andrew, again, we said yesterday, he is an extraordinary character. He's an amazing man, a huge, huge talent, and an incredible catalyst, a wonderful bringing the right people together. He was a great producer because of that, not because he knew what was going on technically, but because he had this fantastic sense of the sound that people had to make and the magic that people had to make. And I believe it's completely true that he persuaded Mick and Keith to write. He recognized that Brian had no talent as a writer in that regard. Brian couldn't write for the Stones. I mean, I don't think there's any argument in that. But he saw that Mick and Keith could, and that was, huge breakthrough.
Mm-hmm. I guess Brian was very good at turning a 12 bar into a piece of magic by dragging in a sitar or a recorder or.
No, Brian was hugely talented and absolutely crucial to the formation of the Stones. And there's no argument about that from anybody. But he, for whatever reasons, he wasn't able to evolve into the, I suppose it was a pop star, really. I mean, I suppose and that's why the band rebelled against Andrew eventually, is perhaps, and I don't know this for sure, I'm just saying that perhaps it was because Andrew's ears and eyes were commercial. And maybe, that was one of the reasons the band felt that they had to escape from that and make their own music, man. And I think that Brian was by that time completely swamped by his own demons and by basically being usurped by Mick and Keith and Mick and Keith's talent for writing,
Yeah. So after that mid-60s period, you go into the late 60s, was it a sense that the focus was changing and does your work change in that period?
I think my work for Immediate Records, for Island Records, for Decca, I think evolved. I think the stuff I did with Andrew at Immediate in the later 60s was really good. I think the stuff I did with Traffic and Soft Machine, for instance, for Island, I think that I evolved. I think I got better in my pictures of Free, which was 69. I think that's a classic portrait of Free. I think I got better. I mean, the stuff I did with P.P. Arnold at Immediate was groundbreaking. I mean, if Kafunta, that was so far ahead of its time, that concept, of trying to find a way to express this person's African roots through color and I mean, I think it was clumsy but it was so far ahead of its time, and technically it was quite ahead of its time. So, I think I was doing great until really the 69, when Immediate crashed and burnt, and I lost my studio in Mason's Yard, and then everything seemed to go wrong for me. And there was a very difficult transition into the 70s. And actually it was Chaz Chandler who I wouldn't want to say saved me, but in a way got me back on track with Slade. Because
that's very interesting, isn't it? It's the same team with what most people would ostensibly think was a completely different project. But like we were saying before, a massively underrated band. I mean, because they were so down to earth and they always play the modest card, they've never been ones for saying they're genius. But I mean, Noddy Holder, amazing voice, great musicians as well, great players. So what was your initial meeting with them? Was that just after the Skinhead period?
No, it was before. It was Ambrose Slade. It was
really?
When they were,
right at the beginning, yeah.
Yeah, it was when they were still, when Jimmy was, in Granny Takes a Trip, velvet jackets and scarves, and they were sort of leftover 60s vibe, and they looked like every other band really, except Dave Hill was always incredibly opinionated. He always had very strong ideas. And I took them down to the South Coast and photographed them by the sea. God knows why. And I photographed them in my studio. And then I get a call from Chaz saying, you better come to the office because we're going to need a new session with the boys. And I said, really? So quickly. He said, yeah, come over now. And so I ran up. I still had Mason's Yard. So this is 69. So I ran up to his office, which I think was in Brook Street or something like that. And I go in and there are the boys in their skinhead look, all looking like kids, you know, and with that fantastic Brahmi accent, you know, all right, you know, and it was great. And I went, oh my God, you know. So then I did the skinhead pictures, and then they, you know, that changing to skinhead, and I can't remember what the first record, what their first hit was, but that was the period that I got lost. I lost my studio. I didn't know what I was going to do. And it was Chaz calling me and saying, you know, are you up for doing another session with Slade? And that was when the skinhead stuff was beginning to grow out a little bit. And I had a studio at that time. I was very briefly sharing a studio in Lennox Gardens in Knightsbridge behind Harrods. And we did that famous picture of them on the cobbles in the Mews at the back of Lennox Gardens. I can't remember what the name of the Mews was. And that was an interesting session because it was in that session that, in a way, the persona of Dave, with everybody looking at Dave, which we did quite a lot over the years consequently. But I think that was probably the first session where the band began to look at Dave and sort of indirectly pointing at him and saying, you know, he's a fucking lunatic, this bloke, you know, watch him, you know, he's going to have the highest boots, he's going to have the worst hairstyle, he's going to, you know, he's going to be the most grotesque on stage. You watch him. And I think that was the first session, and I always loved that session. And then I moved into a studio in Great Windmill Street in later 70, and the band started coming to me, and I started working. So I sort of got back into the music business, and they were, you know, a regular session. I don't know. I did about over 40 sessions with Slade altogether.
Wow,
and I think,
yeah.
Oh yeah. And I mean, we were, you know, we got quite close. We got good friends. Jimmy would come over to dinner. You know, we got friendly, and I really loved them. And I did the Live in Wolverhampton album cover, which was almost the only other live thing that I did after the Stones in '65. And that was an extraordinary experience. Seeing them live was always amazing. And the noise, and that was the famous concert when in the Wolverhampton, is it the Town Hall or the Civic Hall?
Probably the Civic, I think. Yeah,
I think so. Where the balcony was bouncing, and I was on the balcony, so shooting because I was trying to get a picture of all of them on the stage for the cover. Anyway, yeah. So Slade and it's interesting. I hadn't thought about this before, but you saying it's you know, Chaz and with a different artist, but it's very strange with Jimmy. All those years before, I get the same call. I get the call. You better come and we're going to do it because the guys have changed their look, and it's
same office and haircuts.
Yeah. And I never thought about that until now. I've never thought. Weird.
Of course, and probably the most classic is the Slade album cover, isn't it? Which is a very difficult shot to do because in a way they're kind of messing about, but they also look quite serious, and to get that balance, I imagine it's not easy, is it?
The thing about Slade was they were workers. You know, everybody they worked and they worked. They worked at their image, they worked at their music, they worked in the studio. Everything about them, they were hardworking. Their feet were on the ground. I mean, after all, I don't think any of them moved out of Wolverhampton. I think they were all living there except Don. Don lived in London. Certainly, eventually he did, but I think all the others stayed up their roots. The pub that they all went to when they were young men before, that was the pub they always went to because they took me there. And it was like everything changed. The moment they stepped through the door, they weren't Slade. They were Noddy and Jim. All the locals knew them. Nobody paid any attention to them being Slade. They were just the local boys, and they kept that. They kept so in touch with their working class roots, and their work ethic never changed. So going back to your question, that picture, we worked hard at that picture. That wasn't an accident. That was crafted. If you know, it was crafted. I can't remember where it came from. What I do remember, I remember very clearly how clever I thought it was that Don's plasters go over the letters. You know, somebody else would have put the letters over the plasters, but he put the plasters over the letters. And of course, Dave was so pumped up, you know, and had his top off, you know, was really beefing it up, and with his insane haircut. And Noddy's haircut was a sort of, it was a crazy picture. But anyway, yes, it was worked out. I guess the point I'm trying to make is that almost everything we did with Slade, we worked at. That they understood about crafting, they understood about working. It was a complete collaboration. You know, when he had the mirrored top hat, they were sort of glitter. You know, it was glitter pop or glam rock or whatever it was. And I did a background of crumpled silver foil. And they just, you know, they loved it. They thought it was absolutely fantastic, you know, and it just shone, the background shone, and they shone. And Don had a sort of almost like a metallic suit, which was just a waistcoat, nothing underneath it, and these great trousers. And yeah, they were a wonderful band to work with, but they worked. We worked. Even the most casual press pictures, you know, they worked, and they understood about letting Dave would just do whatever Dave did, you know, super yob. Yeah, they were absolutely fantastic. Yeah. No, I wasn't exclusive at all. I just worked a lot with them. And in those days, a band like Slade would probably do, I'd have to check my job book, but we'd probably do 3 sessions a year. That's all. You know, that would give, because they were on the road all the time. So I do that, maybe a cover or 2. I'd have to check the job book exactly to see how the dates are spaced out. But I know I was working for, so the people, my primary clients were Chin and Chapman. So I was doing virtually everything.
Suzi Quatro as well, didn't you? Of course.
Yeah. And Mickey Most. I was doing a huge amount for Rack throughout the 70s. So I was doing Mud, I was doing Suzi, I was doing Sweet, Smokie, I was doing Gary Glitter. So I was doing all that, the Glitter Band. Who was the guy? I've lost his name now. I can't think. But I was really busy in the 70s. Once the 3-day week had got out of the way, once all that, because the 70s were very, very difficult. They really stuttered into life. And although we had, I can't remember when Suzi's first record was, I think it was 73. But 71, I can't remember exactly. I'm not very good at remembering these dates. But there was the 3-day week, and that was an extraordinarily mad period. You just had to cope with it. You couldn't do anything really. You know, you could shoot outside with daylight, but you couldn't process anything. You couldn't print anything. You know, so we didn't shoot very much. I don't know whether you knew, but in the 3-day week, they'd announced in the papers on the Sunday or the Monday, they'd announced what areas would lose their electricity when, what postcode would. So we were in SW1, I think, WC1, and you'd see, you know, WC1. you nothing on Monday morning, you get a bit of electricity on Monday afternoon. So we would plan the day accordingly, you know, in the darkroom on Monday afternoon, or we could shoot a session on Tuesday morning, but we won't be able to process it until Wednesday afternoon. And, you know, we'd work around it like that, but we didn't do very much. And then I really got into the swing of it. And the 70s were an incredibly productive period. So no, I wasn't exclusive to anybody. I don't think I was ever exclusive to anybody at any time. It just seems a bit like that because obviously, you know, I'm famous for certain pictures. But I mean, I worked with Kate Bush, of course, from 78 through 79. So the 70s was a fantastic decade for me once it got going.
And what was it like working with Chin Chapman? I mean, I know they do the music mainly, but they have the concept as well, don't they? They're building these bands around their songs. And was a discussion around the photographs and the images and how that gets done?
Well, yes, there was. Not so much with Mike, who was much more concerned with the music, but he had very strong ideas about certain things. But they appeared to trust me completely. I mean, they gave me fantastic freedom. Nicky was much more involved in the business side of it, the sort of music business side, the record business side. Mickey Most was a sort of a mentor to them, really. He was very, very, very important. But funny enough, a bit like Chaz, he didn't have a great visual sense. You know, he was rather insensitive visually, you know, in a curious way. And he was, they all seemed very happy to let me take responsibility for that. And although, you know, I think it was Mickey and Suzi who worked out the idea for Suzi's jumpsuit, it was me who came up with the compositions and the lighting and the way they should present themselves, and the idea of making the band her gang, sort of supportive, entwined with her, but she would be always dominant. You know, I think that was what was there, but I think it was my visual interpretation of that. And everybody just loved what I did and gave me a huge amount of freedom and support. And
that is a great photograph, actually.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I think my Suzi pictures, I'm very proud of my Suzi pictures. And the fact is, I mean, I'm still friendly with Suzi and I still talk to her quite, you know, regularly. And that picture, the classic picture of her by herself against the white background, which is so similar in many ways to the Hendrix picture. It's completely different, but it's also very similar. You know, that is also an icon. I mean, she's doing a huge concert in 22 and they want that picture as the background. We've already had discussions about it. And so, you know, that was very important. But the 70s were a great decade for me. And I love pop music. So it was a great decade for pop music, you know. I mean, I know we can't really talk about Gary, but Gary Glitter made some of the best pop music of all time. And you know, he was how can I put this? He was incredibly professional. He wasn't, I always got on very well with him, and his penchant for young women at that moment in time didn't really seem to be particularly different from a lot of artists. But Gary was a great subject. I did several great sessions with him. You know, what happened to him afterwards, what he became, was in the future. I mean, I loved the Glitter Band. He was grotesque, but he was sort of handsome. And the thing is, there they were, all dressed up in this grotesque glitter clothes, these incredibly tight trousers and everything, and awful, and they were all, you know, the posing was all sort of butch, but wearing these sort of pretty bright, it was grotesque. It was really grotesque. And I knew that. I mean, with Sweet and with Mud, you know, obviously, and I was taking the piss out of it. a lot of the time. I mean, the pictures I did with Sweet for Ballroom Blitz, for instance, was a complete piss take. You know, I thought it was a really good idea, and they got into it, but it was a sort of piss take out of the whole sort of ridiculousness of it all. But everybody loved it. It was sort of subversive, and there was a subversive quality to the ugliness of the glitter band. I mean, it just seemed, it was like anybody can be a glitter star, you know. Look at the glitter band. Anyway, I loved working with them. I worked with them separately from Gary. We even did a session in Paris once when the glitter band were almost bigger than Gary.
They were. When they split, they had the hits, and he couldn't get a hit, could he?
He couldn't get a hit. And Mike Leander was producing both of them. And Mike Leander was a friend of mine from the early Marianne days. I first knew him when he was producing Marianne in '64. So he was a person throughout my career. So when Gary came up, you know, Mike wanted me to photograph Gary, and that's how I got to work with Gary and then with the glitter band. But I no disrespect, you understand, I'm just making observations. I don't want to come across as being this horrible sort of judgmental. I'm just saying, you know, just saying.
Probably playing in their favour, actually, the grotesqueness. They just look like a really strange street gang.
Yes, in these absurd clothes.
So when punk came along, did that change everything, or was it just a continuation of the invention of the 70s?
No, in a way, it changed everything, and because punk rejected everything that I stood for. I mean, everything by 76, you know, I'd become, you know, I was really quite experienced. I'd been a professional photographer for over 12 years. I was very successful in the sense that I'd made lots of images. I'd worked with lots of important artists. I was working continuously, almost entirely in music still. And punk came along, and for me, it was the writing on the wall. It said, these people don't want you. You know, they don't need you. They want to, you know, they want to open beer cans in the camera. They don't want to look great. They want to look horrible. They want to spit. They want to look nasty. They want to tear their clothes. They're angry. They want to pogo into each other. They want to wear plastic bags. They don't want you. And I thought everything had gone full circle. So my feeling was that there should be punk photographers, and there were, you know, of course there were, and that it wasn't for me, and they wouldn't want me. They didn't want really the studio, and I just felt that I couldn't possibly relate to them. And I went to a concert at the Roundhouse with the Adverts and the Damned, and there were a couple of other bands. And I was absolutely blown away by the energy and the excitement and by the response. And but it was just not for me. You know, it wasn't for me. It wasn't meant to be for me. And I felt that I was definitely going to have to make a career move. And so I decided quite consciously that I was going to move my career away from music. And that's what I planned to do. But punk, in its purest, most energetic form, was very, very quickly absorbed into the mainstay business, the mainstay industry. And before I had a chance to really properly step away, bands like Gen X and The Jam who had punk roots, if you like, but they wanted a more controlled image. So when Gen X came to me, Billy said to me, do for us what you did for the Stones. Mm-hmm. He was the first person ever to do that. And I don't know when that was. I suppose that was 77. And so all that initial punk energy suddenly got turned into what I called slightly dismissively, but actually what I call poser punk, where really there was a punk ethic, there were punk roots in the music. A lot of the musicians started in punk bands, but they wanted to look great. They wanted punk to be fashion. They wanted punk to be style. They wanted punk to be beautiful. I mean, Billy was beautiful looking, and they wanted that. The Gen X as a band wanted to look great. And so I did a fantastic session with them, and got to know them. And I did, I think, 2 other sessions with them. Then the Jam came along. I was asked to do the Jam, not right at the beginning, but I did the Modern World, because the Jam also, through their art director, Bill Smith, who was a friend of mine, who I'd done a lot of work with, they wanted a more controlled approach. And funnily enough, Martin Goddard, who had worked with Bill and the Jam on, I think, the first album, was an ex-assistant of mine. And so I don't think that has any bearing on me photographing the Jam. I think Bill thought I would be, because he wanted the control that I could bring to the shoot and the technique that I had. And so I had that was a very successful session with the Jam. And then Doctors of Madness, although they weren't a popular success, they were a really important band. Richard Strange, who I'm still acquainted with, was a really clever, they were really an important band for a lot of London punks anyway. And I did a great session with them, and they also had the discipline. They were very punk in the way they presented themselves, but they were much more controlled than that first initial burst of punk energy that came with the Pistols and the Clash and the Damned and all those other bands in that initial point where it was really in your face and it was a real rejection of the establishment and everything that went with it. And then suddenly, as I say, within a year, it had been not watered down necessarily, but it had evolved very quickly.
I always felt sorry for Doctors of Madness because they were kind of the bridge between the 70s and punk, and they would have been massive, but all the bands they influenced took their place.
Yes.
Really unfortunate, isn't it?
It is. And I love the pictures I did with Doctors. I did one session with them. It was for a cover. And both the back and the front, I just love it. It looks like they're crawling down the wall. And we shot that outside my studio, which at that time, by then, was in Hampstead in Fleet Road. And it's just because they were so theatrical, because they worked at being the Doctors rather than just rejecting everything else. It was a really good session. And then I did another shoot with them. So I was really thrilled with that, loved working with them. And then suddenly Kate Bush turned up. And the tourist. Yeah, it wasn't a conscious. I don't think anything that I did was that conscious, because I was just trying to work. I mean, I was just doing as much work as I could. I wasn't picking and choosing my gigs. I was just working as hard as I could and being as creative and as artistic as I could and pushing the record companies as much as I could and trying to interpret what I felt the band were doing, and trying to make an image for them that they could live up to and that was appropriate to the music they were making. So I was just trying to do that. I was doing a lot for EMI in the 70s, and they had an artist development department, which was run by a couple of really nice guys who I got to know very well. And they called me and they said, "We've got a new artist and we'd love to play you the record. Come over." So I came over and they played me Wuthering Heights. I guess it was a white label at the time. It hadn't been released, of course. Nobody had heard it and nobody knew anything about Kate. And they played me this and I went, "Good God, what's that? I've got to hear that again, play it again and again." And we played it about 5 or 6 times and I thought, blimey. And then they showed me the album cover that they had for Kick Inside. But they were very apologetic about it. They said, we don't like this cover, but Kate and her people are insisting on it. And I saw Kate, and then they showed me a video they'd made for Wuthering Heights. And I thought, wow, you know, this is this 17-year-old or 18-year-old, and her dancing and her movement and her body and her just everything about her. And she was making this extraordinary sound. And I said, God, you know, I've got to take a picture that's going to stop people in their tracks. And it's going to do what the record's done. They've got to see it. They want to see it again and again and again. And I went away, and we planned to have a meeting with Kate a few days later. And I had to come up with some ideas. And I went back and I met Kate. I'll never forget, she was wearing skin-tight jeans and sort of cavalier boots, thigh boots, right up to her. And she was so pretty, and she was sweet, and she was bubbly and energetic. She had incredible energy. And I said, look, I've just got, the only idea I've got is to put you in leotards and dancers' clothes, because dance is so important to you. And clearly, and I thought that maybe, you know, a simple leotard with some scarves and some practice. And she went, oh, I love that. I love that. So that was that. That was all it was. And she came to the studio, and the only other thing that I did was I got her a makeup hair artist, not two people, but one person at this first session, because I didn't want to swamp her, because, you know, everything was very new to her. EMI had her under their wing for about a year. They'd been nurturing her. She'd made this album. She'd made this single. She and her brothers, I think, had come up with the concept for the album cover, which EMI had fulfilled for them, but they really didn't like it. But she was very inexperienced. She hadn't done any professional photography as such. And so I didn't want to swamp her. And I found this, I knew this makeup artist called Kirsty Klimo. And I thought she'd be absolutely perfect for Kate, because she was sensitive. She wouldn't impose a look or a style on Kate. And she wouldn't change Kate, which was really important, of course. And so I said, look, here, I've got a pink leotard, I've got a green leotard, I've got matching scarves, I've got some socks, I've got this. And I said, and I've set up, as a complete contrast to that, I've set up this old canvas background. And I said, go into the dressing room and, you know, just have fun, just relax and have fun. And I'd kept my eye on them and, you know, made them tea. And then about 2 hours later, she emerged in the pink leotard. And she just took my breath away. And she did exactly what I'd said I thought that they needed. You know, the music took my breath away, and she took my breath away. And I just tried to capture that. And it wasn't intended to be anything other than the promotional image. That's what it was. And I photographed her in the pink leotard and the green leotard. I don't think we did anything else. We did that in pink, in black and white and color. I don't think I did any other shoots on that setups at that session. And I knew the moment we saw the Polaroid, she saw the Polaroid. I just knew that we'd got this magic moment, this look that was going to be stunning, you know, and that was it. And then EMI had brought in an agency called Cream, who had the idea to put the picture on the buses and just to have, I think they just put, you know, wow, or amazing, you know, which were things that sort of Kate said in the way that Marianne used to say back in '64, you know, the word was groovy and everything was groovy. Oh, that's groovy. And Kate was, wow, it's amazing. And I wanted, so that was all it was. And they put the picture out there, and it just, you know, it blew people's minds because it was just a beautiful picture. And there was this staggering looking young woman and the music, and you know, and that was it. That the rest is history, really. And then the next session was to repackage Kick Inside for America. And I did a complete contrast because the Americans didn't want to use, they couldn't use the leotard pictures because they were too sexy. You know, and in America, in those days, even then, there was still the South was terribly religious, as indeed it still is now. So you had to be, and they did national campaigns; they weren't regional campaigns. And so EMI in America, you know, couldn't use the leotard picture; it would have been too offensive to too many people. So they needed a new cover, and I had this idea of making the album sleeve a box and putting her inside the box. It again. Super. That was the Stones. That was really more about creating a physical limit for a band, forces them to make a shape, which is often much harder to do in the studio. And with Kate, I just knew that because of her athletic nature, because of her movement, that she would be able to make great shapes. And so she was able to make wonderful shapes within the box. We put her in an old sort of grandpa type collarless shirt, regular jeans and socks, red socks that she pulled up over the jeans. And so everything was covered. She was covered from top to toe. There was no, they were completely asexual in terms of how she looked. And yet, of course, she always looked sexy. She couldn't help but look sexy. I mean, she was, you know, she exuded a sexuality, you know, which was obvious, quite clear, but the pictures were much more acceptable, and everybody loved them, and that became the cover for Kick Inside in America and many other territories abroad. Whereas the leotard picture was used as the Wuthering Heights cover, and then I did the pictures for. I can't think what the next record was, but I worked with her for about a year. Through until 1979. I think we did 4 or 5 big sessions together. And the leotard theme, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, famously, she's very in control of what she does. I mean, did you find that at all? But it sounds like she's very open to your ideas.
Well, she was very open to my ideas, but she was very, she wouldn't do anything that she didn't want to do. I mean, but it felt like a real collaboration in the very truest sense. I mean, you know, I suggested leotards because I thought it was a visual reference to dance. It's not complicated, really simple. They look beautiful, very, very simple. They're nothing to do with fashion. Fashion dates pictures often. And I, you know, as I said to you yesterday, I'm not very interested in fashion. So the leotard for me answered a lot of questions, and it did a really good job. And I just knew she'd look wonderful in it. I didn't know how wonderful. I just knew she'd look great. But she was always controlling. It's a different thing. It's not that she was dictatorial. In fact, she was very cooperative. But she was, when you showed her a Polaroid, you know, it was pretty much yes or no. And I had to fight sometimes when I knew that something had real potential, but we weren't there yet. You know, often working with musicians, I would compare a Polaroid with a demo. You know, I'd say, look, this is a Polaroid. This is a demo of what we're trying to do. I think it can be better. I can make the lighting better. You can make the pose better. If you lean into the camera a little bit more, you know, it's going to be better. And sometimes people got that, and sometimes they'd look at it and say, no, I don't think it works. And if I knew that it had real potential, I'd have to fight for it a little bit. I said, well, hold on for a bit. Let's do another one. And I'd try and sell it to them. And with Kate, that was sometimes a bit of a fight. So I wouldn't say she was controlling in the sense that she was dictatorial. I would just say that she was controlling in the sense that she would never do anything that she didn't want to do.
Mm-hmm. Well, how different is a dynamic working with men and women for a photographer?
Well, that's a good question. It on one level, it's not different. They're musicians, you know, but on another level, it is different because how they look is really in society. How a woman looks is really important, and everybody, I said yesterday, everybody wants to look great. Everybody wants to look their best. Everybody wants to look their best. And my job is to try and make them look their best and also project an image that they can live with that encapsulates what they're trying to do musically. That's sort of my brief to myself. So in one sense, there's no difference. Suzi Quatro is part of the band. She is the lead singer. She's part of the band. The fact that she's but I hesitate to talk about sexuality in this day and age because I know that I'm opening a can of beans here, and I don't really want to go there in that much. But men and women want to be sexy. There's no difference in that sense. So really, fundamentally, there is no difference. But you have to be a little bit more gentle, sensitive. You have to perhaps even be a little bit more reassuring. Maybe you have to maybe you have to just be a little more sensitive if there's a woman around. Sometimes you don't. I remember Caris in Catatonia. She was one of the band. She was really quite tough, and there was no difference. The only difference was that she was charismatic and the band weren't. With Annie, Lennox, even in the tourists, Annie just swamped the space. She was just magnificent from the outset. These are all women who are in control of what they look like, really. I might give them ideas. I might say, why don't you wear this? But they're in control of what they look like. And, but everybody wants to look great. I don't think I ever met anybody who wanted to look ugly. I don't think so. I'm trying to think about it. They all want to look great.
Yeah. So really, there is no difference.
I don't think there is. No, I don't think there is. There might be a slight difference in approach, but but I think you have to be sensitive. I haven't had many failures in that, but the few I have, maybe because I was not as sensitive to something, I missed something, or I had my concept just was wrong. I got it wrong. I got it wrong with Smokie in the very early session. I thought they were sort of the Eagles of the North. I thought they were like Bradford's answer to Crosby, Stills, Nash and Young. And I couldn't have been more wrong. I was wrong. And I stole the idea. Chin and Chap liked the Mike Chapman liked the idea. I think even the band liked the idea initially, and were willing to participate in it. But in the end, it felt completely wrong to them. And in the end, they really weren't that at all. And so although I'm very pleased with the first cover I did for them and everything, it was wrong. I made a mistake. And I was wrong. There was a band called Magazine, and I got it wrong with, I've blocked out his name because it was such a...
Howard Devoto.
Yeah. I got it wrong with Howard. I'd had a meeting with him, and I thought we got on really well, and I thought I understood what he was after. And he was talking about the strangeness, the off-kilter nature of the music, and I thought I'd caught that in what I was trying to do, but he objected to it vehemently. I mean, he was really, really hated what it was, and he wanted to leave the session, and I wouldn't let him until he called Virgin and said, "I'm leaving the session. I don't like what the photographer is doing, and I'm leaving the session." Because I wanted him to make it quite clear that I was very happy with what we were doing. you know, and I loved what we were doing. And indeed, the 2 setups I did were fantastic. And they're, you know, they're high points for me photographically, but I got it wrong. I misunderstood something, or I misinterpreted what he was trying to do. I think you know, possibly he was out of it on something that I didn't understand, and he was a strange guy
person, which is part of his greatness, I guess. Yeah.
Look, maybe it is, but I, as I say, I think that I misinterpreted something. I thought I'd got it right. I'd got it wrong. And instead of working with me, he decided that I was the enemy, and he treated me like that, which I wasn't happy about, because I would have preferred to collaborate and work with him, you know. But that was that, you know. I got a great picture out of it, but it was a disappointment as a session. But most of the time, most of the time, I don't mean to say I'm right, but most of the time my sensitivities are appropriate and correct, and where I'm going with the way I see something is usually right, because I'm working for the artist. I'm trying to make the artist look great always.
Yeah, I mean, the word you've used quite a lot is collaborate, which is interesting. You know, it's, yes, you have an idea of the visual elements of that band, but you're trying to meet halfway, aren't you? Really?
It's always a collaboration. If it isn't a collaboration, it's not fun. I can't work in spite of somebody. You know, I've tried. I mean, I've had a couple of not very successful sessions. Usually they're with heavy metal bands who aren't really very interested. Maybe they don't really know why they're there. You know, I haven't had a chance to meet them. They don't like having their picture taken, so the way they handle it is to fuck around and sort of almost dare the photographer to get a good picture. I'm no good in that situation. You know, Mick Rock might be much better, or Bob Gruen or somebody like that might be much better than I am in that situation. I can only really work with people if they're working with me, and when that happens, it's a collaboration, and it's invariably a success.
I didn't know you'd done the George Harrison pictures for Cloud9, because they don't seem to be in your style. They look quite different.
Well, that's interesting that you say that, you see, because I think Cloud9's very much my style. I mean, it's a little bit later. It's 86, I think. I think that the thing is about style is that when I started off, I didn't want to have a style. I in a way, I don't really want people to see me before they see the artist. I don't want people to look at a picture of somebody and say, oh, that's a Mankowitz picture. That would be a failure for me. I want people to say, bloody hell, doesn't she look great? Or doesn't he look fantastic? Or that's an amazing looking band. Who did that? So I've tried to adopt styles and techniques and formats that I think are appropriate to the artist. And I knew George a little bit. And the art director, David Costa, is a very, very old friend of mine. And we worked together on lots of things. And he said to me, you know, George has asked me to do this cover and I'd love you to photograph it. And I think the working title is Cloud9. I really can't remember that. But we've got to do it in the studio and blah, blah, blah. And so we came up with the ideas with a series of big painted backgrounds. In the 80s, I was using a lot of painted backgrounds. I'd found a guy who painted backgrounds for the BBC and had a huge warehouse in Battersea full of these backgrounds, which he'd rent to me for 50 quid a go. And so I used to go down there and put a rolled canvas background on the roof of my car, tootle back up to Hampstead. And I had these 2 or 3 skies for George's cover. And I had this idea because of you won't remember, you're too young, but there used to be a TV cowboy called Paladin. Richard Boone played him. He was a dark and sinister the man in black. Everything about him was black, and black clothes, black moustache, black Colt 45. He was the man in black. And George had this beautiful black silk Indian Nehru style jacket, beautiful jacket. And he had this black Gretsch guitar. And I had the idea of doing this portrait of him where the guitar is sort of part of him. He's not holding the guitar. It's actually held on, it's braced onto a stand and sort of stuck into the picture so that it's coming out of him, almost like it's growing out of him. And he's looking, and the angle is low, and he's looking into the sun and the blue sky with little white clouds. It's like a film still. And it's the man in black. That was the inspiration for it. You know, I could hear the music, you know, the man in black. And that for me was the big portrait. And then we did the other ones with the reflective glasses. So I had a sky background in front of him, reflecting in his glasses, the mirrored lenses, and then a sky background behind him. And then I did him on a great big canvas that I had of him just sitting on a little chair, little bentwood chair with a guitar, and also looking great. And then David had the idea of doing exactly the same shot, but without George, for the back cover. And we just put his jacket on the back of the chair. And George was fabulous because not only was he a wonderful subject, but he was such a sweet man. And he arrived by himself, no entourage, nobody, no driver. I mean, he drove himself. I mean, I know that sounds pathetic, doesn't it? Of course he drove himself, but it's not what you expect of somebody like that. You expect him to be chauffeured. You expect him to arrive with a man holding his clothes. He came in with his own clothes, and he was so sweet. He was so funny. He said, "Do you think I'm all right parking there?" I said, "I think you should probably park on the side street." Oh, right, okay. And he was just so sweet. And he came in and he worked all day with us because it was technically quite complicated because I was shooting on a big format camera. And it was just a lovely session. And we had lunch. I gave everybody a big lunch. And he was funny. He told us filthy Liverpool stories from his youth. And it was just so funny. We just had the loveliest day. And so productive, and a real collaboration. I mean, that was a collaboration between, you know, me, George, and David Costa. I mean, it was just like magic minds working for the same purpose.
Yeah. So he had a good visual eye, and he's always the best dressed and most photogenic of the Beatles anyway, wasn't he?
I suppose he was. Yeah, I suppose he was. I mean, I think they've all done, you know, I mean, but he was always, you know, he had that lovely thinness in his face that photographed well, and the cheekbones and everything. But he understood, you know, when you're working with really intelligent, experienced professionals, and you say, you know, I said to him, look, you know, this is looking to the future. I want you to look into the light as though it's the sun and the guitar and it's the man in black. And he just got it, you know. And when you're working with somebody who just understands what you're trying to do, agrees with it, and they add, it's a jigsaw puzzle. And if they don't have that last piece, it's never going to work.
So I know nowadays you basically curate your wonderful archive, really, but are there any people you wished you'd taken pictures of?
Oh, crumbs. There are so many pictures I wish I'd taken, artists I wish I'd worked with. I mean, yes, there are, you know, there's Bob Dylan, there's Elvis Presley, there's, you know, endless people that I never got a chance to work with. I was never asked to work with. But I've worked with so many really good people. I mean, in a way, I think what I miss is I'm very happy working here, working with my archive. But what I miss is that collaboration. And so I like doing books now. I loved As you know, I was executive producer and curator on Icon, Music Through the Lens, which is just shown on Sky Arts and will be shown all over the world this year and next year. And the collaboration of working on that was really exciting. I mean, it was the most exciting project that I'd done since about 4 or 5 years previous, when I worked with an artist called Christian Fur. We created a series of images called Fur Mankowitz, 45 RPM. And we created a show together, and that was a fantastic. I miss the collaboration, and particularly this last year, when I'm working by myself here, completely by myself. And, I love Zoom because it gives me, it's like, I love having chats with people. But I miss the collaboration. And what I don't really miss anymore is, it was getting a bit repetitive. And one of the problems with working in music for me, as Christ, I've been doing it for over 50 years, is the fact that, the majority of the bands are young men. And young men, it doesn't matter whether we're the 60s or the 70s, 80s, 90s, or the noughties. It doesn't matter. They all fundamentally present the same problems. The fashion might change a little bit, not that much, but a little bit. But how to photograph them is that the issues are exactly the same as they were 50 years ago. And most young men want exactly the same thing. They want to be mean, moody, and sexy. I mean, there's no two ways about it. So it was getting a bit repetitive for me. And as I was losing touch with youth culture, it was getting harder for me to relate. It's hard for me to relate to heavy tattoos, and it's hard to me to relate to massive amounts of body piercings. I can't relate to that. And so it makes it hard for me to know how I would photograph that. So in a way, although I miss the collaboration, I don't really think I miss the work. And of course I would have loved to have worked with a lot of artists that I never got to work with, but missing things, it's not really a good way to lead your life. You just move with the times. And in general, I'm incredibly happy with the life that I have now. And I don't miss taking photographs at all, really. Commercial photography wasn't becoming fun. It wasn't fun anymore. And as I say, it was harder for me to relate to the musicians. And I got an email last week, immediately after Christmas, from somebody saying, "Do you still work with bands?" And I do. I will. But most of the sessions that I do are with old friends, artists like P.P. Arnold. I did P.P. Arnold's new album cover last year, and I did a cover for her the year before. That's where I'm more likely to find a job. I haven't really answered your question. Yes, there are endless artists I wish I'd photographed, and there are endless covers I wish I had done. But that's it, Who gives a fuck?
The ones you have done, it's pretty good catalog.
Yeah, listen. I think I've had a pretty good. I never worked with David Bowie. I knew him a bit right in the early days, but I never worked with him. And I would have loved to work with him. I never worked with the Beatles. I mean, Ethan Russell, who's a friend of mine, or an acquaintance at least, he's the only photographer who officially worked for the Beatles, the Stones, and the Who. I mean, that's quite something. I never achieved that.
I think Hendrix and the Stones is pretty good.
Yes, thank you. Thank you. I've just done a book of my Marianne pictures, and I'm thrilled with. I did 9 sessions with her in the 60s, and I've put a lot of them together in a book, a sort of privately published book. And I can do that. I'm going to try and do my Kate Bush book self-publish that this year. And I've got a book on Slade that I want to do eventually, which I'll have to self-publish because I don't think I'll be able to get a sort of, a mass publisher to do it. I've just done a Stones at Christmas. I did Stones Going Home. I did my at-home pictures with the Stones in a book, which is a lovely little book, which is out now and doing quite well. So I don't miss anything because I am always so busy, and I feel that this is the right way. This is, if you're lucky enough. I've been so lucky to have worked with so many fantastic artists, and modern digital technology allows me to revisit that work and to represent it. It's a wonderful thing to be able to do. And so I just feel very privileged. And did you get a chance to see Icon Music Through the Lens?
Yeah, great.
I think that for me, that's a really important, that in as a sense as a person evolves and gets older. One of the things that I've become increasingly aware of is my contemporaries. I mean, it wasn't really until I started doing my exhibitions that I started making friendships with contemporaries who I'd known of for decades, but never really knew and never met, who I felt in competition with them, and I felt envious of them, or I felt overwhelmed by them. And so I didn't have friendships with other photographers really, except for the photographers that I shared studios with. So it's only in the last 30 or 25 years that I've become friends with a lot of photographers and admirers of a lot of photographers who were previously, I wasn't mature enough to admire them. I was still envious of them and jealous of them. And I for a long time, I've wanted the genre of music photography to be taken seriously, because I take it seriously and have done for 50 odd years. All these other photographers, are incredibly serious about what they do. And yet, in a way, people hadn't taken music photography seriously. It was always packaging, or it was always, it was a giveaway or something. But it was incredibly important part of the culture, important part of the industry. And so I always wanted that. I always wanted to try and do something about music photography. And now with Icon Music Through the Lens, I've been able to do that together with, Andy Saunders, my fellow executive producer, and Dick Carruthers, the director. And that is a great collaboration. I mean, that really is not just a collaboration with the three of us, but a collaboration with nearly 70 photographers,
Yeah, because it kind of, as you say, it does state the case for music photography being an art form of its own. It's not fashion photography. It's not wildlife photography. It's got different techniques, different ideas, different ways of working, and different results as well, isn't it?
It has. And yet music is so key to all our lives. And that music photography is such an important part of that. Even in a culture that's rejected albums, I know that this vinyl is having, there is still vinyl. I'm not saying that there isn't vinyl, but now people cherry pick their favorite tracks, download them, and that's it. They don't even know what the cover looked like. We're back to the days of listening to Radio Luxembourg on an earpiece and not knowing what the band looked like. I didn't know what the Beatles looked like when I first heard Love Me Do or Please Please Me, whichever was the first one. I didn't know what they looked like, because I was hearing it for the first time. But music photography is so important. So I was very pleased that we were able to do that.
More important, I would say, to cut through the noise of the internet. A great photograph will cut through 10,000 images flashing at you. So in a sense, a brilliant image and a brilliant photograph is more powerful now.
Well, that's a very interesting point of view, and I hope you're right. I think so. I certainly think that the response to the TV series has been absolutely fantastic. And I think that there are people, serious music lovers, certain music aficionados love the images. They just never really looked at them without the music. And I wanted them to look at them. Just you look at the cover, you love the artist, but you still see it as a package for the music, which of course it is. But it's such an important part of the experience. You know, it's subliminal. You sit there listening to an album and you look at the cover, you read the lyrics, you roll up a joint, but it's so much part of the experience. So I wanted to try and get that, you know, that was a really important milestone for me. I'm not sure what the next one will be.